Florida Writer Podcast, a discussion about writing and other things. All right, hello and welcome to this edition of the Florida Writer Podcast. I am here with Peter Meinke. Am I saying your name properly?
Meinke is good, thank you.
Meinke is good.
Yeah. Many people miss.
Well, you know, it's got that E and the I, and I understand. Yeah. Exactly. What is that? Except for when my neighbors, there's a whole little saying with that, and it's cute, but I can't remember what it was. So now that really sounds silly on the air. You are considered the Florida Writer Poet Laureate. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And what does that mean?
Well, spend a lot of time telling everyone what you do as poet laureate. That's the main question I get asked. Basically, I represent poetry. This is the first time it's been done by the poetry writers. It used to be just a governor's appointment, and now they have an election set up so that they pick somebody nominated throughout the country, throughout the state, by all the poetry clubs, and they funnel 3 names to the governor, and he throws a dart at these names, and one is chosen. This is me.
Is this like a year-long appointment or a decade-long or?
It's 4 years.
4 years.
We've done it for about 3.5 years, about 6 months to do it. Basically, what I do is I'm sort of a Johnny Appleseed, going from school to school, libraries, groups of people interested in writing, and I read poetry to them. I try to get people to like poetry, to enjoy it. I don't give sermons, not too many lectures, and it's just to spread poetry around, particularly young people coming here tomorrow, a whole group of them that I'll speak to. I think it's a very good thing. Poetry is underread in America. You go into a bookstore here and you know where the poetry books are. They're in the dark column with dust on, with Emily Dickinson and Robert Frost and 2 or 3 other books, but not much. So part of the job of a poet laureate is to try to make it more popular, more read, more familiar, less scary.
Less scary.
That sort of thing.
I have written my share of poetry, and I started out of desperation, meaning I needed a place to put my thoughts, and they came out as poetry, and I was really surprised at myself. But the first time, I will say, I was a believer in poetry. I had to teach poetry. I was a professor. I stepped into somebody's role, and they had a poetry section. I was at a complete loss until I heard Sylvia Plath's Daddy, read by Sylvia Plath on the radio. It was some anniversary of her death or her birth. I suddenly understood what poetry was. But I always like to say to my students, it's trying to say the most with the least amount of words. I don't know if that's what you would say. How would you define poetry?
Well, poetry is an effort to get out in a new way that makes sense to people. Very intense information that usually is longer and more boring. So poetry condenses everything, which makes it both stronger, and for people who don't want to give it enough time, who read too fast, it's a little harder to understand. You can get over that by a little familiarity that you felt when you heard Sylvia Plath read. That's helpful to hear it be read, and that's part of my job. But poetry is condensation. My best friend is a novelist, and he had the office next to me at Eckerd, and he piles up the papers, and I pile up little teeny sentences, because he's a putter-inner and I'm a taker-outer.
Oh, that is great.
I'm whittling it down, everything, because I have the same thoughts as everybody else, in nature and love and children and homes and war, whatever it is. And what the poet tries to do is to really get down to the bone. That's very touching, moving, scary, to hit the tight emotions that are buried under there. And you do this by surprising people in the way you say it, not so much about what you say, but the way you say it. So everyone has had trouble with their daddies, as Sylvia Plath has, but no one has heard it quite from her voice. We all have voice prints, I think, like fingerprints, and a poet has a more clearer one that's more direct, a voice print.
When and where did you begin writing?
Well, like my wife Jeannie, who's here, who started drawing very, very early. I started to write very early, and it was in Brooklyn. And I immediately intuited from just a few questions or statements I made to friends in Brooklyn. It was a tough place. It was Flatbush, and no one else knew anything about poetry. And I got the idea that this was something sort of secret. And they'd say, "What's poetry? What are you doing?" My parents didn't read it. My mother did belong to the Book of the Month Club, and I saw an anthology of poetry. And for some reason, at a very early age, as soon as I could read, uh, I liked poetry and got the idea that it was secret and I shouldn't go in there because no one else was there. And that appealed to me enormously.
What a great way to look at
And so
poetry. It is a secret language, isn't it? It's like a
yes,
secret club.
exactly. And that was very appealing to me. People thought I was in my room doing homework, which I hardly ever did. And I was reading poems or writing these little nonsensical poems. I was, 7, 8. And when I finally got to high school, it was still sort of a secret, but one teacher found out because I knew she really liked poetry and could recite it, which was rare. And I would send her a poem now and then. When I graduated, in the yearbook, they had the saying, so-and-so wants to be, probably will be, and mine says, Peter Meinke wants to be writer, probably will be censored.
Probably will be censored.
It's happened.
Have you been censored?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my.
So, in a poem, I don't use bad language hardly at all. But once in a while, it's the right word. Some magazines, of course, can't use that. And they would pull that off and send it back. But there were other magazines. Today, they're much more lenient.
Tell me about poetry structures. There's the free form, there's patterns.
Yes. It goes in waves. We're at a good spot, I think, in America now. When I began, never took a writing workshop. So I'm 85 now. So when I was in college even, they had no workshops. So I didn't even read contemporary poetry. Hamilton College thought, why study contemporary poetry? It's ridiculous. You've got to study Shakespeare, which I did. I loved it. Probably was good. But I learned in college formal writing. Not formal, but by reading. I wasn't writing at all, except to myself. And I was among the group that published sonnets and villanelles and this sort of thing. And back then, this was in the 50s when I began to publish, I would send out these formal poems, and many magazines wrote back and said, sorry, we don't read formal poems anymore. They all were reading free verse, like the beatniks had taken over. And I liked them too, I loved it. But so, anyway, what has happened today is that it's equal. It's like hairdo now. Remember there was long hair against the neat people. Now everyone more or less can write what they want. And I still lean toward formal poetry. I love the sound of it. I think it's an extra bonus to the reader to read a formal poem, but I write free verse too. And I think that's a good way. The bonus is, if you read a lot of poetry, you read the same thing as someone in a free verse poem, but then there's an extra pleasure when you read it and you say, oh, gosh, that's a villanelle. I didn't realize that. That was amazing, because your form is supposed to be something you look through as you read it. You don't look at the sonnet. You're looking at whatever the love poem is. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And you're reading that. And you don't care whether it's a sonnet or free verse, but that's another thing to like about it. Just as you might like a piece of music, but then it's particularly good when you recognize that this is a violin sonata or something. It's a little extra knowledge that's more pleasurable, I think. I tell my students, form makes you smarter than you are because it has a mind of its own, because it's looking for a word you would normally think of that has to rhyme or fit in a structure.
It's true. What do you do, though, when you come across something that's just off? Does that bother you, or do you just rejoice in everybody's poetry?
Hardly. I've closed many a book early on, and many a poem in a magazine. I've learned enough so that if there's a glimmer of hope in the first 2 or 3 lines, an interesting word, even though I may not know it somehow, I will hang in there for a little longer and until I give it a chance to prove itself, because I don't believe a poem has to be easy at all. I know a lot of poems are ridiculously difficult, and you work and then you understand it finally, and it's not worth all that work. It's not. not that interesting. But I think you shouldn't write down to readers. But I don't worry about not finishing a poem or a book of poems.
Of someone else's.
Of someone else's, yes. Or even I'd stop my
Of your
poems.
own.
Well, I have a lot of notebooks with unfinished poems.
What advice would you give someone who has written poetry and would like to have their work become more widely read?
Well, you have to get it out and test it. That's absolutely true. The easy thing is you just send your poems to magazines. This is what I did. You can enter contests, which I did. You get opinions back. I didn't do enough of showing it to my friends, but I think that's a good thing to do. I think I did a mistake in that. I've always considered poetry as very private and personal, and I worked hard to get it just the way I want it. I don't want anyone to tell me anything. So I would send it out, and I would keep sending it out until someone accepted it. But many times they gave me advice, and most of the time I didn't pay attention, but sometimes I did, and listen. You should listen to people who know more than you and about writing and publishing. And so the best thing you can do is also you have to read. You want to send out poetry. If you haven't read that magazine, it's sort of silly to send it to them. See what kind of poetry they do. Is your like that? Is your poetry as good as that? Poetry is a long-term endeavor. And the other thing I would also say to this person is don't give up, because Emily Dickinson didn't publish her. She couldn't get her poems published, and she kept writing and writing and putting them in the closet. And just writing is a good thing. I think it's win-win to write poetry. It's good because it's an effort at communication. It's good to get it out there, and you just have to keep trying. Is my advice. And if the same poem comes back from 12 different books, you might try rewriting that poem. 12 different publishers.
All right, Peter, do you have any poetry you want to share with us?
Well, I'll just do this short one because most of them are way longer. But this is the way Yeats ends his books, and this is the way one of my books ends too. It's called Epitaph. Below these live oak branches lie a poet's ashes, pale and dry. He loved the feel of books in hand, but saw his words as driven sand. Still, he dreams as you pass by, although you may be far from home, that if you pause to read this poem, the leaves might nod and understand.
That was beautiful. I have goosebumps. Thank you so much. All right, now it's time for our rapid fire.
Okay.
We're going to start with our rapid fire. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. Whatever comes to your mind, that's what you tell me. What is your favorite TV channel?
41.
41. What's on 41?
That's MSNBC.
MSNBC. All right. And if you could paint anything, what medium would you use?
I would use oil painting, I think. Partially, it gives you a break. You can repaint.
There you go. Fix your mistakes. With
Jeanne
pencils,
does pen and ink. That's too hard.
with pencils, we can erase. Computers, we can backspace.
Yeah.
How about if you could talk to any president about anything, who would it be?
I'd like to talk to Obama because we liked him. We would like to share what he has to say today.
All right, Peter Meinke, thank you so much for stopping by.
Who knows what I said?
It's fun, isn't it?
It's been a pleasure.
This is Allison with the Florida Writer Podcast. Thanks for listening. Allison out.
Peter Meinke was the first Poet Laureate of St. Petersburg and now is Poet Laureate of Florida. His most recent book is Tasting Like Gravity, a 2018 print from the University of Tampa Press. He is published in 8 collections in the prestigious Pitt Poetry Series, and his book of essays, To Start With, Feel Fortunate, received the 2017 William Meredith Award. The Piano Tuner, a collection of short stories, received the 1986 Flannery O'Connor Award. He's won awards from the National Education Association, PSA, and Fulbright organizations, and has given readings throughout America, including at the Library of Congress. His wife, artist Jeanne Clark Meinke, has illustrated many of his books, including his children's book, The Elf Poem. For more information on the Florida Writers Association, visit us on the web at www.floridawriters.net.